to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we're joined by Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast to discuss why aren't there more women in prison? Tim.
If you take we brought Todd Lewis on here because I think he's very good on this question here on the Praise of Folly podcast, which I've been following for a number of years. And if you take sort of one of the central issues, and I think it's going to come back as a central issue once the nonsense of the last 2 years dies down in Ukraine and the virus stuff, is sort of the feminism in general, women's rights, whatever you want to call it, is an essential issue. So if you take the sort of HR department line, all institutions are supposed to be equal. You say, well, how many men are in Trump's cabinet? Now, actually, Trump's cabinet might actually have a lot of women in anyway, but this is a common sort of ploy that's deployed at, you get this sort of general question. Well, here's an institution in society, the prisons, jails, the different other names you could call them, mass incarceration, which is almost exclusively dominated by women, dominated by men. And if you do a lot of maneuvers that some anarchists like Chomsky or even anarchists like Hoppe would do, or Nick Gillespie will say, Reason Magazine, like the what is crime thing, it'll take away so-called violent crime. Now, that's probably a misnomer. But if you do those kind of maneuvers, you just only look at violent crime, it's actually even more men. Or you do another what is crime maneuver, which gets into a bigger issue. Like, the real criminals are like bankers or war profiteers or something like that. Well, you got the same thing. Henry Kissinger, Dulles, and again, you take other societies, Goebbels, Goering, etc., Stalin, Lenin, and intellectually, of course, which is sort of common. This is not a particularly radical thing to say. Is the top of society almost always is men, and the bottom of society is almost always men. So prisons are full of men. So if the sort of general arc of so-called equality keeps getting marched forward, will this be addressed here? Now, a simple thing is just say men's performance are fat-tailed, which is sort of the MGTOW line, like something like 60% of men don't get to reproduce historically. Battlefield deaths, almost all men historically. Suicides, again, almost all men, which you could view as a kind of proto-crime in a sense. Actually, the ways men commit suicide are actually more like certain. Like, there's sort of like, this is sort of the claim that Milo made, is like, if there's certain ways you commit suicide that aren't like certain, like a gunshot to the head. Come on, there's no way. That's not an attention grabber. That's a finishing maneuver. So yeah, that's why we brought Todd on here. And the question is, in some ways, it's a politically correct way to just discuss a politically incorrect topic. But it's also an honest question here. To some extent, I think, you take the prison abolition movement seriously, which it's sort of a joke in a sense, as we saw after January 6th and, Biden and these sort of deep state people. That was a joke. But if you take the prison abolition movement seriously and would this be a win for the MGTOW? So thanks for coming on the show, Todd. And first of all, do you agree in general with the sort of insight here, the question? And what would be your answer too? Thanks for being on here.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I think that's actually a good point. I think the first thing I'd want to say is, I forget who wrote the book, but I think 2011, 2012, there was that black nationalist type author who wrote The New Jim Crow about the prison system as a way to basically exploit black male labor. Well, if that's true, then the left has to admit that the prison system is Jim Crow for men. And it's the new slavery for men, not just black men, but all men, because men are predominantly in prison. And if what that book, The New Jim Crow, says is true, then that confirms what Barbarossa said, the MGTOW author, that modern day society is Jim Crow for men. And I think that that's just an inescapable conclusion from what they themselves are saying. They don't say that because they have prior commitments against men. And we also have the idea of the disposable male that the MRAs have been pushing and advocating. Men are more likely to die on the job, more likely to die on the battlefield. And again, the left is more than happy. Look at the way Ukraine has been dealt with, right? They're more than happy to give men the proverbial white feather to go die fighting the Russians when they really need them. And that's another problem as well. And so I think that there's this deep-seated prejudice against men in the left that prevents them from applying their own conclusions about prison as a whole to men in general, because again, they are predominant in prison. And then we talk about, well, why don't we equalize prison? I mean, there's certain male activities that you could decriminalize, which would then reduce the supply of male inmates. Or there are certain kinds of female activities that you could criminalize, which would put more women in prison. I don't see either one of those things happening anytime soon. I also think that when we talk about men in prison, we need to look at the fact that there has been, for a long time, differential sentencing. So you go back to E. Balfour Bax, The Fraud of Feminism. He points out that I think it was in the 1830s, up until like the 1830s in British law, men and women were sentenced equally for the same crimes. And then he says, beginning with that point, around that time, they started changing, and women were getting lighter and lighter sentences. So, the women say, well, we want the same pay for the same work. Well, ipso facto, you should have the same penalty for the same offense. But for the last, 200 years, women have been differentially sentenced. And so you could argue that this is a clear case of prejudice in the judicial system, where it's not so much that men are committing more crimes than women, though that may be the case. It's that women are being more lightly sentenced. And furthermore, if you look at like some of the works of Paul Elam in the MRA community, we also see that the reports of domestic assaults are actually very high from women. It's just that they're not taken seriously. There are accounts of, men who call the cops because their wife is like throwing bottles at them or doing something, and then they arrest him. So, part of the other problem is people don't take it seriously when a man reports that his girlfriend or his wife is violently assaulting him. And I mean, again, that might be because if he assaults her back, legally he can't really do that because we know how the courts are going to do that. So he's kind of hamstrung. And second of all, even if he could assail back, if she has a gun or, a knife, it's what people in the army say. It's like, even if you could win a violent confrontation, you could still get maimed or killed by being unlucky. And so you should avoid these confrontations in general. And so I think the prison system is a Jim Crow for men and a kind of neo-slavery for men. I think there's differential sentencing based on women being the privileged sex, and that was a book you told me about, Swithin. And then the fact that women, so the crimes that they do commit are both underreported and underpunished.
I think that's mostly accurate. Tom referenced The Privileged Sex by Martin van Creveld. And he goes an historical survey of how women have always had a relatively easy ride when it comes to especially criminal sentencing and general the place in society, especially for low status males. Any woman of not particular great standing or whatever would typically have higher social standing than most of the men. There was one case he cites in which I think from the Greek period that the woman's on trial and the lawyer basically strips her naked and goes to all the male judges. Would you put such beauty to prison or fine? It's like, no, we wouldn't do that. And she gets off. So this is hardly a new thing, although, as Todd mentions, this seems to become particularly dominant in the last, say, 100 and 150 years or so. I mean, just for some numbers, I mean, I just looked at it recently. Just looked now. The prison population in 2021 in England, sorry, it's England, the UK, England and Wales, approximately only 0.004%, and I'm rounding up, of the inmates are female. That's kind of not very many. Now, I would, and as you said, women do tend to get shorter sentences in most cases, although there are certain circumstances in which they do get longer sentences. They can do, particularly in certain child cruelty cases, but not in a lot of the cases. Those they don't actually. But there seems to be a case whereby if they're so bad that they get a more serious one. So I mean, for instance, now he was in prison as well. There was some infamous murders in the 1960s. The Moors murderers, Myra Hindley and Ian Brady. I think she died in prison. They tortured some children and killed them, basically. And she was genuine in life imprisonment. So was Ian Brady. So there are situations in which they will get relatively severe punishments, but it tends to be rare. And in most cases, they get off. I mean, one of the classic arguments for why they won't punish them as much, like, oh no, but like the children. Oh, I've got some children. I can't go to prison. And it's like, well, I'm pretty sure it's a good idea to put his dad in prison because that's not going to harm the kids in any way. But apparently that argument doesn't fly. So, yeah. Now, what I would say is, though, as well, is I think a lot of female as Todd was saying, like domestic abuse. I mean, from Erin Pizzey, who worked in sort of some of the battered women shelters. Oh, was it battered women's? Yes, she did. And found basically that in many cases of like domestic abuse, it makes the case that both parties are violent rather than just one of them. I mean, it can just be one, but a lot of times it's both of them. But it's only ever the men who really get any issue from the law from it. And that's also even in the case, although this is how some feminists argue how I remember I was doing a debate on equality once in a place I used to work, and then we were talking about equality, and then this is more income inequality and equality, and just like, oh no, the prison system is sexist because in domestic disputes women use weapons more, and I was like, oh, okay, pretty sure that's kind of prison worthy if you assume you think prison is a good idea. So we'll tend to use weapons more as well. But again, it's predominantly male. And then also the way the adverts work as well. It's always male perpetrators. As well, actually, with that, you get things like the NSPCC, the National Society for Protection of Cruelty to Children. It basically is like, oh, all the perpetrators of violence stuff against children are male. It's like, no, most of it's female, because they're with females most of the time. So yeah, it's just it's just crazy. As what I was going to say is, I think a lot of female sort of offences, as it were, tend to be more reputational. They will do engage some property damage, and they will be violent, but a lot of the time it's basically getting other men to do stuff for them. In many cases, or it's reputational damage, or it's just being sort of breaking up sort of social groups and generally being unpleasant and trying to manipulate and get control that way. And so the fact that they tend to avoid direct violent confrontations is probably one of the reasons why. I mean, even if you had, for instance, a fair justice system, I still wouldn't expect there to be more women punished than men, unless of course you were going to start punishing like lies and slander much more, in which case, yeah, women would be. But assuming you've eventually got similar offences as you have today and you punish them more equally, I still don't think you would have that many women imprisoned or punished for that. So those would be my sort of general opening comments. Tim.
My next, I am somewhat pushed back, but the murder rate and the number of male murder offenders in the United States in terms of by gender. Now, again, we could get into sort of a rabbit hole, which the Supreme Court period did, what is a male and what is a female, which I don't really care to do, but just sort of accept sort of some logical definition. But something like 9,000 of the murders in the United States last year were committed by males, and which is like basically 7 times the number of females. So, one of the things that showed up in the 2020 summer was that, different groups commit crime at different rates. Wouldn't you argue, both of you, that men on general commit, actually the most, speaking of the sort of Jim Crow book, most of the crime happens between men between like 15 and 35, or something like that in that neighborhood. And that's also true for school as well, school punishments. In terms now, again, you can always go to the what is crime question here, which is somewhat hangs over here, and there's sort of maneuvers out of it as well. But if you just focus on violent crime, which seems to be sort of reasonable, wouldn't you argue men commit more felonies, or what we call felonies, murders, and so forth? Todd, what would you say to that? It's sort of it's if you aggregate, take the numbers out, what would you make of that?
Right. Well, I think first of all, to riff off Swithin, a lot of violence done against children is by women. It just goes underreported, again, because children spend most of their time with women. So, how many of those are counted actually? And then second of all, modern day society is begging the question on what is homicide. I mean, I would argue, and throughout almost all of Western history for the last 2,000 years, abortion is homicide. So women far exceed men when it comes to homicides. We just have this, irrational loophole that's not homicide. If you ask the last 2,500 years, the Hippocratic Oath says, I will not give a poultice to a woman to have an abortion. They knew that that's homicide. And these are pagans. So I would argue that actually women commit way more homicides. They're just not prosecuted for it. Second of all, when we look at what a feminist would say is, well, look, men just commit more crimes. That's why they're in prison. But that's obviously fallacious on their part, because if, say, somebody from the right says 13% of the population commits 50% of the crime, they'll say, no, that's environmental conditions. Okay, well, then men don't actually commit more crime. It's just bad environmental conditions. Which way is it going to go, Miss Feminist? You can't be both ways. And so there's that. And I would also say that one of the reasons when we look at these current conviction rates and current, rates of committing crime, it would be interesting to compare this to data from, say, 100 years ago, which I don't know how easy that would be to get hold of, because we lived in more cohesive societies where families stayed together, there was more trust, and men weren't routinely going around shooting each other. So, like, for example, someone like Walter Williams or Thomas Sowell would say, well, we grew up as poor blacks, and we remember, sleeping on park benches back in the 30s and 40s. And there wasn't all this gangland violence. So some of it is clearly driven by social and economic conditions. And we can then ask what social and economic conditions that may or may not be. But I that's what I would say, Swithin.
I definitely take your abortion point. I'm pretty sure there's going to be more abortions in England than there are murders in general. Although I suppose if you were to take that out of the equation and that was made illegal, I do think it would be the case you would get more male offenders than you would get women. But Todd is certainly right to point out the clear disparity in the way in which, especially the feminists, deal with this. Everything is social conditioning and environmental determinants, except when it comes to men who are somehow these great sort of Nietzschean Ubermenches who can just get beyond the herd and act as purely independent beings and make women's lives misery. That is entirely accurate. And as Todd points out, most of the criminal acts do seem to take place between males between the ages of 15 and 35. It's something like that. To what extent that's the case? Probably because men, to a large extent, are higher risk taking. I think particularly of lower IQ levels, which I think actually correlates with higher testosterone levels in general, although not entirely. And so, you're going to get a particular tail of society that is particularly more crime prone than others. But as Todd points out, clearly there's lots of other social factors which would get into why crime of this group, this group would be more crime prone in a certain society, and in another one they wouldn't. As Walter Williams and Thomas Sowell would always say, the hood wouldn't really exist to a large extent, or was a lot smaller back in the 50s. And now these certain cities, have high murder rates. And actually interesting with the murder rates and predominantly black gangs, is it gives, as an aside, an annoying thing with the gun control debate, because everyone in England goes, oh no, America has lots of gun deaths and murders. And it's like, well, yeah, but if you get rid of the black gang murders, the murder rate in America isn't actually very high. And so it just skews it to a large degree. So those would be my sort of general steps on that matter.
To further add to the point, Peter Hitchens in his Brief History of Crime would make the point that if you applied Victorian policing standards to current day society, like public cursing, things like that, huge numbers of people who are currently not out of jail would be in jail. It's worth adding that to that point. As far as the future of this question is concerned, I think there's some argument, actually I think there's a pretty good argument to be made, that it's going to get worse. If you look at schooling, if there's sort of two arguments for schooling. One is the sort of signaling / insurance policy. The other is the more standard, it helps you get ahead in life argument. And both of those boys, again, we get the question of what is, but if you look at those boys in general have been doing much worse in school, significantly worse in school, and it's been getting worse. And actually, the COVID thing has probably made it even. Well, we'll see. But in some ways, the COVID thing might have even made it worse in terms of reading and other activities here. That's to be known. There's maybe an argument made that being left alone is actually better than being there. But it depends on who's actually watching you and what's the alternative there. But there's some argument, if you look at the sort of today's crop and you sort of project that forward, it might get worse. And again, there's lots of maneuvers you could always do, but if you look at sort of jobs and you look at sort of what things, and Tyler Cowen will make the point as well, the MGTOWs, that that sort of, you take stereotypes even remotely seriously, the modern economy skews toward women, and you add hiring standards as well, it goes that way. So Todd, would you agree that this sort of males being incarcerated will probably get worse, so to speak, in terms of general population? Like if it's now like something like 80%, will it go even higher? I think there could be an argument to go higher. Would you agree?
Yes and no. I think it will. It could go higher in the sense that as society breaks down, more men will feel themselves being driven to do violent crimes. But I think given that 13% seems to be a large part of the prison population, given that also there's a lot of activist progressive judges that are just not going to prosecute minorities, we could actually see a decline in the male prison population, because the perpetrators of these crimes are just things you can't see. Nothing to see here. These people don't exist. This isn't happening. These are just hate facts. And so we can sort of see this in places like Portland, where these activist judges give very easy bails, and the police just stop arresting people because it's like, well, if I arrest this guy, he'll just be put on bail and get on the street within 6 months. And depending on how that goes, we might see fewer men in prison. Again, I don't know if that's going to be a dominant trend, but if that trend continues, we could actually see less.
I think the question is, I think, when it comes to men in prison, depends to a large extent on how the authorities wish to control society. Tim, you showed me that video about some of the Foucaultian-inspired ways of looking at various societies. The sovereignty, a disciplinary society, and then I think Deleuze talks about the control society. In which you can basically control everybody's behavior by cutting off their access to the internet and banking and other things like that. So it may end up being a situation whereby you don't need to put as many people in jail as part of the kind of disciplinary processes of society. So I think that's a possibility. Although, there's always the goal of expanding the prison population. There's always benefits to doing that, because, well, that means you get more budgets, you get, especially in America as well, you get cheap labor, as Todd pointed out before. So I think you're probably going to get more in. It's just probably going to end up being whiter and less minority based, so that they can say, well, we're not being disproportionately harsh, etc. I think that's probably one of the ways that is to go. Just as a side, we implied, I don't know if we've implied so far that somehow the fact that men are treated more harshly, this is kind of implies some sort of female control of society as a whole, which I think is true to some extent with respect to the family. But anybody of any wealth is made any money is male, and the highest earners and the pullers of most of the power are almost exclusively male. So I don't really see that as a main thing. I think what you have with men in prison, effectively have, you could argue, a war of certain men against other men. And the way I would describe this, now whether this is conscious as such is another question, but a way that you could conceive of it is it's more of a move towards a pre-Christian society in which you have a certain number of few very rich men who basically have their own harems. Because one of the ways of criminalizing lots of men and harming their economic conditions is that they basically become much less attractive to women. And so that means that the men at the top can basically acquire more women for themselves. And so I see society moving towards more of more towards like a de facto polygamous society, irrespective of what the feminists think might be happening. And those men in power have that kind of, now whether consciously they're doing it or not, but it ends up on the margin to be in their interest, increase the relative social status between them and the rest of the other men, I think is at least a partial explanation, a partial motivator and explanation of the current situation.
Yes, one of the, as to riff off what Todd was saying, one of the politically incorrect ways to fix the disparity in prison populations is to put one ethnic group more into the population than another ethnic group, which is sort of probably what in the end will be the way, the Biden types will eventually fix this thing. Your point about anyone being of wealth being male is entirely true as well. In the power pullers and so forth, I would also agree with that, Swithin, as well. Moving on to your point, I touched on your point number 3 about the Foucauldian idea of the control society here, with as opposed to a more disciplinary society. The control society is very much what Todd's books I've heard once he said was the Brave New World, which is, you have the Orwellian dystopia and you have the sort of Brave New World dystopia, which is sort of actually, in a sense, it's to some might be called a utopia, but it's sort of like a society controlled by, the sort of drugs, things like that, vices, things like that. So, and if you look at drug use, you get sort of like more recreational drugs like marijuana and DMT, which is Joe Rogan has popularized. But you also get, other more hard drugs. This again is a market which, from my understanding, skews male. I could be wrong. I haven't done precise. Again, these are certain areas where it's hard to get statistics about. What's the illegal drug market here? Which again, whether they're actually illegal or not is a good question. But that's another one way in which society arguably controls the sort of large underclass. So Todd, would you agree that drug use and other certain vices or means to control this sort of, what you say might cut down, which I actually would agree in some ways it would probably cut down at some point, it might grow at some ways, other ways too. Would you say drugs and other sort of vices like that are ways to control this burgeoning underclass? Todd?
Yeah, I would agree that the sort of, this is something that I know that you'll be familiar with, Swithin, that Rothbard mentions Etienne Botti, and I always find it interesting that Rothbard missed the most important point of Botti's discourse on voluntary servitude, that it's through the vices of the people involved that the golden chain of the king can pull people up. and make them dance. He seems to completely forget that part. And so, well, he does and he doesn't. Because, right, in his Democracy, the God That Failed, Hoppe points out that he attacked model libertarians, MLs, who were just, Randian, dopers. But on the other hand, Rothbard seems to hem and haw on this. So it's kind of interesting. But certainly libertarians should be more familiar with this argument. I guess minimally speaking, they just don't develop it much. We also have, again, Brave New World talking about this as well. But also, to your point, Swithin, that the system is some men, i.e. the wealthy men, over other men, using, say, women as a tool. That I would substantially agree with that. I mean, this is sort of like what Aristotle points out in the Politics, the idea that tyrants, those who want to rule through arbitrary decision-making process, empower women at the expense of men. And this is something that E. Balfour Bax points out in his, Fraud of Feminism. The goal is to build a totalitarian control grid where women are just sort of like snitches. And we even, and stool pigeons. And we see this also in 1984. George Orwell says, that, was it, I forget the love interest, whatever, but she's for one of those socialist youth leagues. And he says that women are the best snitches. And so, we see this from Aristotle. We see this from socialists. I mean, Orwell speaking from experience because he went to Spain. And this is just one element of the control grid whereby, and you control men in two ways, right? On the one hand, you control the sexual supply. And so then you get men to do what you want because if they want to get the sexual supply, they're going to have to play ball unless they just take it. Like we see in these, criminal under Olympian proletariat communities. And then the other way is because women are a privileged class, they can hit you, but you can't hit them. Then they're snitches. And they can, there's this great line, there's this great commentary in C.S. Lewis's The Four Loves where he talks about friendship. And he says that if a woman enters a male circle of friends, what once was a meeting of the minds and, philosophy and literature, because they want to include the woman in the space, then becomes something much more mundane and basically becomes trivialities and gossip. And of course, it's this meeting of the minds, these sort of like pub meetings, like, for example, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, where all of these radicals organized and planned their revolution. But if you can just sort of short circuit that element, then they can't come together and meet and create these new movements. So I think basically in that sense, women are functioning practically as class allies to the, bourgeoisie. So this is a very like anti-Marxist thing.
Oh, no, I'd agree entirely. With the females into male spaces, I think that's the goal, is to prevent sort of male organization. Because you're exactly right. I mean, I'm not opposed to mixed spaces as such, but men would very much be happier if they were allowed to have all male spaces of which they could just be all male. But I think that is considered dangerous by the powers that be, because, well, when that happens, stuff might get done. And of course, we can't have that, because we need to control and organize and centrally plan society with a permanent bureaucracy. So I think that's entirely true. As a really random comment in this is, I watched a number of cookery programs, which you may be surprised by, and competitions maybe with chefs, and a lot of them don't do well in school, and they're a bit of a dropout, and then they get into a kitchen and they like it and they become good chefs. Now, what a lot of them say is they like the atmosphere of the kitchen. Now, they don't say this, and it's not always true, but most of the kitchens are almost entirely male, if not entirely. And it seems to be in commercial kitchens in sort of relatively high unrest. Not all of them, but it's predominantly male. And I think they probably like it because it's one of the few places where you can basically be around other men for most of the time, as opposed to working alongside women and having a pretty even split labor force. Breaking up male spaces, bad men in general, and I think, as Todd said, it's basically a counter-revolutionary act.
My next question here is related to capitalism in general. Now, you always get into the question of what is real capitalism, what is fake or crony capitalism. And me and Swithin did a question of, if Marxism is true. Me and Swithin did an episode which sort of led us to do this episode. If Marxism is true, why do they want them to work in factories? Why do they want women to work in factories? And we sort of riffed off the work of David Graeber, gift economies and things like that. And so the question here is, if Marxism, the relationship between Marxism and some version of capitalism, we can also pejoratively call it neoliberalism. Again, people like Rothbard and Mises would say it's sort of phony, although Mises says any society with a stock exchange is somewhat capitalistic. So most societies today, even China and Russia, have stock exchanges. To what extent is this issue of the sort of disparity between the genders, as they generally considered existed, is a sort of, a sort of part of the general class warfare? Now, again, I remain a capitalist for purely like sort of a priori logical reasons, in the sense that I just think, it's sort of a superior economic system. I don't see this sort of idea of the different logics for different class groups that people like Ben Burgess and Marx imply. I'm not sure exactly what they support, but to what extent is this part of like a way, sort of a capitalism idea to control, maintain control of society? And like it seems like in your work you say this will be like a time bomb that'll eventually just sort of explode the whole thing. I think one of your old roundtables say liberalism is a solvent, and if this is one of the fruits of it, what's the prospect of it? Because in a way, it's a sort of dystopic future here, what you're laying out, a black-pilled, pessimistic, or some other words you say. So, I mean, two questions here. What's the relationship between Marxism and capitalism? That's the first concrete thing. Should the Marxists be more men's rightsy, we'll say? And number two, what's the future here, Todd? I think you're good to answer this. Is it all black pill all the way, or what's the general out for you?
Well, I think Marxists should be MRAs, and in fact, arguably the first modern MRA was a Marxist, E. Balfour Bax, because it was anti-revolutionary, reactionary to have women in these male spaces. Because if we look at the history of labor in Europe, in Russia, and in the United States, the various degrees to which they had successes was all based on a kind of muscular workforce. All men, locked and loaded. They had shotguns and rifles. Swithin, you pointed out in our Second Amendment stream that the reason why there was the 1926-28 gun law was to prevent the workers from rising up and taking over England. So on the one hand, disarming the workers is one of the things that capitalism wants to do because it doesn't want them to rise up. But it also wants to create a diverse workspace, not just sexually diverse, but racially diverse, because a diverse workspace can't organize. So, for example, this is a practice that goes as far as the written record, as far back as Carthage. So Polybius, in his account of the mercenary war, says that Carthage hired mercenaries from all sorts of different backgrounds, languages, religions, so that even though they outnumbered the Carthaginian ruling elite, they couldn't ever work together. They had different, too many things were separating them, so it made it easy for the elites to control. We saw this same practice in the Caribbean islands in the heyday of the slave era, where Negro tribes from different parts of Africa were interspersed together on the assumption they wouldn't trust each other. They wouldn't unite to rise up, which is largely true. Now, obviously, there was the mercenary revolt, and there was Haiti. So if you push people far enough and hard enough, that'll overcome those divisions. But that's more of a fault of the elites. So there is this drive by the capitalist elite to diversify everything. And so, yeah, Marxists, I think, would have to be MRAs, because there's no other way to organize a revolution in order to appropriate the means of production. I mean, women aren't going to do it. We've never seen that happen. And then as far as how bad society is going to get, I mean, I think we're already seeing some pretty stark trends, right? One of the trends we see is lower fertility rates in the West. So because of this socio-sexual economic setup, one of the problems is going to be okay, well, there's more older people than younger people. So there's going to be a crisis in healthcare because there's not going to be enough people paying into healthcare to keep the old folks alive. That might lead to state-sanctioned euthanasia. The other problem is, they say the Islamic countries. Now, again, some of them have struggling birth rates as well. But if we look at within Europe proper itself, though, the Islamic sub-communities, and certain fundamentalist Catholic and Reformed sects, like Catholics in France, Reformed in Holland, are having higher birth rates and will at some point probably take over because the people that bought into this order will just go away. I think another reason why capitalism is skewed towards women is women are the majority of consumer spenders. And so if you want to have an economy that's rooted in consumption and rooted in style, fashion, and fads, as we see with The American Prosperity by Paul Mazur, 1920, one of the founders of Lehman Brothers. He talks about the shift from producing and consuming for need and producing and consuming for style and fashion. Women are going to drive that, not men. It's like I think 80% of consumer spending is female. So another reason why they're going to skew to that. What that means is consumption spending isn't productive spending. It's one of the classic points of the more shift libertarians is that you don't have a loan for consumption. You need to have a loan for something constructive. You build a business or you build infrastructure. And so it's going to lead to capital depletion because you're just going to be mortgaging the future for things you're just going to consume, not things you're going to actually build. And it's also going to breed resentment between the sexes. TFM once said that most men in the West are de facto MGTOW. They don't know that they are yet, but they act like it. And I think a good example of the truth of his statement is that recently the Twitch streamer Asmongold basically just went off in a very MGTOW-esque way. I'm not even sure he knew he was being MGTOW, but a lot of things he was complaining about society, especially how it negatively affected men, millennials and Zoomers, it sounded like a MGTOW, and which does seem to indicate that even somebody who's normie, who's a streamer, who's a video gamer, whether he knows about MGTOW or not, is sort of talking like a MGTOW would talk.
Oh, that's probably because he's just imbibed all the racist and evil statements from Gamergate, but that's another issue. I've completely lost the train of thought.
The question was capitalism versus Marxism.
Oh, that was capitalism. Yeah.
Those are the two questions.
Oh, that was it. So capitalism. So what I would say is this: any ruling structure, if its goal is to increase its own power, is always going to want to divide society to some extent to prevent any organization of resistance against them. I mean, Stalin diversified members of areas of the Soviet Union with more ethnic Russians to prevent them from rising up. So you would divide them. I don't think that's necessarily unique to sort of the current economic order. Let's call it capitalism, for want of a better phrase. Now, I do think Todd's point on consumption is probably interesting, and I do think relative to how the banking sector and finance is so important today, compared with the past. But I do think that playing on people's desire for new stuff actually sort of makes sense with that. So I could see why consumer spending and credit cards and stuff. You want to make it look as though you're being good to the women folk. Although, again, though, historically in the current dispensation, because you get the corporation as a major organizing force from, say, the 19th century onwards, the owners of corporations try as much as they can to treat people. Well, you get the human resources department. You don't get the male resources and the female resources department. It's the human resources department. It is the same. And so there's you could argue to some extent the logic of the corporation, not necessarily, but you could say that there is moves towards that direction, so trying to sort of break down the order of men and women as distinct. And of course, as Tim, you mentioned that in corporations, when you're running these big organizations and all of it's basically administrative and following the rules, well, women quite like doing that and they can do it relatively well. And so, again, that would be a reason why you would try and coax them into the workforce. Obviously, of course, it's beneficial for the government for multiple reasons, for indoctrination of children and tax revenue. But I think the fact of women, I think, comes from the modern economic form of the corporation and the banking changes. And I think the banking stuff predominantly changes, well, not entirely, from, say, the 1910s onwards. And obviously the corporation is somewhat earlier. And I think you really get that driving force, and that changes things. And then obviously sociologically, women working during wartime. And so I think that's why you've tended to get that sort of move towards female sort of co-option, as it were, by the capitalist class, as you could say.
Todd, would you go as far to say you're on board the Adorno, Marcuse, and some of these others 1960s? They're somewhat famous for saying that they're somewhat famous for being against most popular consumption culture, everything from the Beatles to like, the sliced bread type thing. Would you go too far as that in critiquing those? So again, I remain sympathetic because I think it's part of the inheritance of the Anglo tradition, partly, and partly for logical reasons, capitalism's sort of ascendancy. Would you go as far as to say you're a socially conservative Marxist in a way, just for different reasons? And again, I think you outlined why they will fail, and also, why as presently constructed they will fail. But would you go as far as to go along with that line of argument, Todd, to say that, because you have this sort of Keynes dream that everyone works 20 hours a day, but then consumer society popped up, and that sort of happened, and we get this consumer culture. Now, I would again agree with Swithin that the sort of Keynesian banking is probably what did it in, which is the sort of Mises would go with that, the expansion of credit. But that would be my argument there. Would you go as far as agree with Marcuse and Adorno and similar thinkers on the left like that? And would there be any thinkers on the sort of paleo right, so to speak, who said that point earlier? I think you'd be good for answering that.
Right. So as a sort of like anti-consumerist critique of the low culture of the modern West, yeah, I would agree with that strain of criticism. Now this is where it gets kind of problematic, right? I mean, this isn't the first time I've been accused of being a right-wing Marxist at this point. Part of the problem is there's a lot of baggage with those concepts. And I think that when we talk about labels, we need to understand, well, what's within the Overton window and what do people most likely understand? And then we have to make the distinction. Like, for example, I've been called a Christian anarchist before. It's, I guess, true as far as it goes. But then the other question is, once we unpack all that and look at maybe a broader scope of ideas and explanatory concepts, I think it becomes sufficiently weaker. But yeah, maybe fellow traveler is a better word. I think that I would agree with them on that case. Probably the best thing to say is this idea of the commons. You hear this a lot, the tragedy of the commons. Now, obviously, that's just not true. England had commons until 1850 with the enclosure laws. And so what ended the commons was arguably the rise of the immortal institution of the monarchy with the Normans, and then the extension, the reinventing of that with the Glorious Revolution of the immortal institution of banks. And so they constantly were cutting off territory that was, quote unquote, the commons. The real tragedy of the commons is diversity. You can't share things in a radical communal society like the Hutterites was all ethnically homogeneous, and that works. In England, it worked because England was English, right? There weren't all these other people around in the Middle Ages. So maybe something like the Diggers might be a little bit more accurate is what I'd say. But if we do, though, look at like consumption and culture and how the problem is, what does that mean for men and women in this way? We can look at how in the capitalist system. See, the underlying thing that I want to get at here is this. When we look at modern forms of production, not just capitalist production, but modern forms of industrial production, as pointed out by Jacques Ellul on Technique, there's this overriding urge for efficiency. So even like classic Marxism, they're like, well, we need to be efficient. In fact, we're just more efficient than capitalists. That was the claim that they made, an empirical claim that turned out not to be true. And in that regard, I think that what's driving all this is that if you mandate efficiency above all else, then especially in your mode of production, then what's going to inevitably happen is you're going to turn people into fungible carbon units. And the reason why men are vilified more than women is it's easier to turn a woman into an androgynous carbon unit, androgynous worker carbon unit, than it is a man. And so you have to the state or the industrial system or capitalism or whatever has to expend more energy to push men into the, fungible economic carbon unit. Because if you look at Thorstein Veblen's concept of the machine process, from resource extraction from the ground to the finished product at the supermarket or the retail store, you have to have these completely stable processes that are not at variance in any way. They're not fluctuating. They're highly controlled, highly stable processes where specialists make interstitial adjustments. And if that's gone, any sort of particularity isn't going to thwart that. And the goal is to reduce all particularity, hence the drive towards fungible carbon units. And I think that's a broader extension of industrial society as a whole.
Before Swithin comments, I just want to quick add another comment/question. You could take it as praise, but you could argue that the historical Marxists were MGTOWs or definitely bro club away, because the historical labor unions were just sausage fests. I mean, especially when they were successful, like the Pittsburgh rail strike, like the general strike, I think in 1922 or whatever in Britain. You look at the historical labor movement, especially when it was really in power. It's mainly dominated by men, and I think you should have two focuses. You have the class, but it's actually a form of class in a way, but it's just the class. You're not sort of, instead of proles and owners, it's sort of a different class. Would you take, is Karl Marx a sort of historical MGTOW? Is Lenin a historical MGTOW, would you say, or is that too much of a reach? Again, you could always say terms change, term words, but do you think that would be a reach to say, Todd?
I think classic Marxism is it's implicitly pro-male in a way that modern day political systems aren't. And I remember there was Richard Spencer who said that, way back when the alt-right got started, in 2012, in his alt-right podcast, he said, modern day leftists, this is even before the woke movement, would call the Soviet Union fascist and right wing because of its stance on, race and gender and all that stuff. And he's absolutely right, because that's what happened. Caleb Maupin, a prominent Marxist today, is being attacked as a fascist, as all these things. And so there is a certain level of truth to that, I think.
I agree with Todd. I think that the classic Marxists are implicitly pro-male. It's all about the proletariat. It's all about the worker and the organization against the capitalist. And it's quite sort of the whole sort of Marxist view of things is very masculine. It says, obviously, of course, you get the feminist movement out of Marxism. We get the oppressed class. But the way the classic Marxists, the pre-feminist ones, talk about it is, well, yeah, but we can kind of organize and raise above it. Whereas the feminist Marxists are like, oh no, we've just been oppressed. Oh, oppress us less. Whereas the classic Marxists can kind of organize and kind of get those things changed. Todd is interested to state on the commons and the tragedy of the commons not necessarily being a tragedy. My understanding is that the enclosures actually started in the 15th century, and interestingly was 16th century, and Henry VIII did them. And interestingly, I remember reading an argument that this was a ploy of Henry VIII to get the support of the burgeoning merchant class to consolidate his power relative to the nobles. I've heard it interpreted as a classic sort of Bertrand de Juvenel high allying with the low versus the middle. And in this case, the middle being the aristocracy, the high being the king, and then you got the merchant class, relatively speaking, on the bottom. So that goes back a long time. Now, I would say on the commons as a thing here, is I do think the homogenous people with similar goals makes it easier. Although commons and common land and stuff would have been probably more difficult, the extent to which you have relatively more mobile populations. So I think that's something to take into account, how they could have taken place over time. Because I think just ethnic homogeneity, I mean, you might need even more sort of like local homogeneity to make it kind of work, possibly. But you'd have to figure out how that could do. So I think there's something with transport and mobility, which actually relates to the men and women. Although what is very relevant to say here, though, is basically the practical only reason why the current economic dispensation can attempt to treat women as different to men, as the same as men, and put them in sort of like the big cog in the machine of the modern corporation, is because of birth control. In the absence of that, it simply wouldn't work. That you haven't got a lot of women in the workforce because somehow they've all become celibate. That hasn't happened, and doesn't seem like it will ever would happen to a large degree. So that's something that needs to be sort of factored in here. But whether or not, as I said, the Todd mentions that Torsten Politz, was it? I think.
Thorsten Veblen.
Thorsten Veblen, sorry, I'm thinking of somebody else. Sorry, yeah, Thorsten Veblen. On the carbon use, I can see that to some extent with efficiency with corporations, although I think that's possibly like a long-term approach with putting down. Well, no, I say because I do sort of think you do get distinctions recognised between men and women in corporations. The HR department is entirely female, and the R&D department is entirely male. Probably sales is almost entirely male as well, to a large extent. So I do think the distinctions are recognised, but I do think that they are deliberately glossed over, basically men in line to a large extent. And it is easier to manage women than it is to manage men to a large extent. So I do think that is true. And so to the extent to which you have a situation where men, you've got larger firms in which you're going to need stronger control with like procedures and stuff, that's definitely going to be something that tends against men and favors more women. I think that's probably true. Tim.
This will be my last comment here. If anyone wants to add on, that'd be great. If they don't, that's also great as well. The reason I asked this question, sort of brought in these other question, is, if you ask the question why are there so, you could also ask the inverse, why are there so many men in prison? Well, the sort of standard left-wing answer is to say, crime. The left-wing answer, usually it's environmentally determined. Like if these people had, UBI, or these people had opportunities and so forth, they wouldn't be this way or so forth. Now, whether that's true or not is a good question. But it's one of the sort of standard moves. That's sort of why I run into sort of the capitalism, Marxism debate versus the male-female debate, and sort of over what is the sort of mode of economic production in our society. So I think this has been a very interesting conversation. That would be roughly my final comment of sort of why. Sort of a politically loaded question to get into, sort of more of a politically incorrect topic here. If Swithin or Todd have any other final comments or questions, that'd be great. Thanks for doing it.
Yeah, I'll just say that the main reason why men are targeted more now is because it takes more effort by the state or the industrial process to turn them into fungible consumer carbon units than it does women.
I think that's possibly true to some extent, although I wouldn't go all the way with that. But I'd just like to thank everyone for listening. Thank you, Todd, for joining us. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family. And subscribe to us on Podbean on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings, and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason, please contact us at mindcrimelibernyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibernyshow@gmail.com.